are going to get through this. Easy for listening. I was able to do it. Easy for dancing. I'm not a great lover of cats. That's my fear. You're a disgrace, you are. Not me. That's my fear. You're a disgrace, you are.
Hello and welcome to Shadowboxing. Today my guest is Dennis Grosvenor. Dennis, welcome. You traveled from Sydney to Perth. What was the occasion?
Well, I was invited, I received a phone call many months back from resident action groups here in Perth, specifically because I'd made a documentary about state politics and the underlying web of corruption in New South Wales. And someone over here had purchased a copy of that documentary, and when they watched it, they saw parallels, and not necessarily saying corruption, but at least in process, or the corruption of process, here in Western Australia. And they felt that the story of New South Wales told in that documentary was pertinent to the situation they currently found themselves in here in Western Australia. And they said, would you come over with the film and present it and say something about it and tell us something of the history of making that film? So I agreed to do it, and I'm here. And I'm here.
Everyone remembers you as an actor back starting in
well,
the
not
70s.
Everybody. A lot of those people are dead now.
Already? No, sorry. Tell us something about how you started your career and what you've done and how you've been involved in television and film.
Well, acting is something that I always wanted to do, but I didn't start out my working career as an actor. I didn't go straight to NIDA. I never went to NIDA actually at all. A lot of my early working life was in physical manual labour. I actually worked on the Snowy Mountain scheme on one of the last dams they ever constructed in that scheme, the Blowering Dam, and I was a dump truck operator and helped build that dam. But night after night on night shift, I'd go up and down that dam, and as much as I enjoyed the work, I thought, well, it's time now, Dennis, to go back and try and do what you really want to do.
Have some change.
And make some change in your life. You're getting on, you know, you're 23 years of age. So I came back to Sydney, and I was particularly naive. I knew absolutely nothing about acting, and I spoke pretty badly, so I needed a voice coach, and the voice coach introduced me to Shakespeare, that I knew nothing about, and it helped me prepare audition pieces. And then I went to agents, and of course they didn't want to know me because I'd just come back from the Snowy and I was basically a truck driver.
Yes.
So I realised I had to start making stories up and telling them that I'd been in amateur theatre in Tumut, near the Snowy Mountains, which I'd never been in. But I thought, well, I better school myself on what avenues are available to get into acting and something about Australian acting. So the most prominent Australian actor that I could think of at the time was Chips Rafferty. A lot of people may not remember Chips, but Chips was a great Australian actor from the 50s and early 60s. And I phoned up his agent and said that, you know, I'd like to have an interview with Chips Rafferty. And my accent was, my diction was so bad she misunderstood what I said, and ultimately she gave me his address and organised an interview with him. And I went out one day to his flat at Rose Bay, and he arrived at the front door in his dressing gown and said, who are you? I said, well, I'm the actor who wants to talk to you about your experiences in the Australian film industry. And he said, wait a minute, he said, I thought you were a journalist who wanted to talk about my experiences in the Italian film industry. And he said, I've never worked in the Italian film industry, but he said, I wanted to meet the fool that would come out and ask me such a question.
That's good. Good start.
Yes, it was a good start. Anyway, he's a very nice man. He said, look, he said, I'm not ready yet. He said, go around the corner. He said, give me half an hour and come back. And he said, I'll have a chat to you. So I went around the corner and sat in my car, and half an hour later I came back. Chips made me a cup of tea. And he said, remember, this is in the early 60s. Yeah. And he said to me, my advice is don't do it. And he said, I'll tell you why you shouldn't do it. He said, because in this country, he said, at this moment in time, he said, if you had an Australian and you shot this on a film, and he flew through Sydney Harbour and under the harbour bridge and did loops over the top and came back down again, and you put that on film, said it was an Australian, he said, they'd laugh you out of the cinema. No one would believe it. However, if you said it was an American who flew that plane, they would believe the scene. And he said that's the problem we face in Australia at this time. They don't believe in themselves.
That's sometimes still the case because we got so much of American programs on television still and on cinemas. So with our little Australian film and television industry, which is very successful, we're still not believing ourselves.
Well, I think we do, but I think the confidence has increased quite considerably since those days.
Agree. So, what was the peak of the career of your acting?
Well,
what do you think?
When you're an actor, you do a lot of work to survive, and a lot of the work you do, you don't particularly want to do, but you do it because you have to survive. But once in a while, things come along that stay in your memory, and you think, well, that was worthwhile, that was something worth doing. And by coincidence, the first thing that has always stuck in my mind, and I always felt was one of the most important moments in my life as an actor, actually happened here in Perth.
Yes.
And it's when I came over here in actually 1971, and I was specifically brought over here from Sydney, and at this time I'd only been playing very small roles back in Sydney and guest roles usually as a baddie in the Crawford television shows. And I was brought over here to play the lead in a controversial play written by the English writer Dennis Potter called Son of Man. And it's a very controversial look at the life of Christ. And I played Christ in that play. And we filled the theatre every night from the opening night. But there's a story that goes around about anybody who approaches this role that it is cursed, or any production about the life of Christ is cursed. And of course I laughed that off. But I think it was on the probably the third night after the opening night, the third performance,
yes,
we had a very steep raked stage that came down, and I had a scene where I had to, when they blacked out the lights on stage, I had to walk down this steep raked part of the stage. And on the third performance, third night into the season, I fell over and broke a bone in my foot. And I ended up in, I limped through the rest of the show and ended up in Perth Hospital for that evening. And they were ready to do operations to repair me. And I said, no, you can't do that. You know, we still have 3 or 4 weeks of the season to go.
Back to the stage.
And the next morning, there were TV cameras in my hospital room, and you had a tabloid newspaper at the time, and I can't quite recall what the name of that.
The Mail?
May well have been the Mail. But anyway, the next day, I was on the front page of this tabloid newspaper. There was a picture of me with my foot up in a sling in Perth Hospital, and the headline over the top was, "Christ breaks foot."
Great.
What we did was I bandaged that foot up, and for the next week I played Christ holding a staff, which was reasonable, I suppose, as he spent a lot of his ministry in the desert. And as the foot gradually, one way or another, repaired itself without the operation they suggested, I then got rid of the staff and we completed the remainder of the season. But getting back to your point, that is one of the highlights, because of the play and the potency of that play, of the career.
So that was the film, television, and the long-lasting career, because it went longer than 30 years. You stopped being an actor, and something dramatical happened in your life when you came back from one of your travels.
You're referring to the fact that I came back and found my street being demolished. Is that what you're referring to there? Yes.
The shocking experience.
Yes. Yes, I did come back from holidays, and the street that I once knew that had magnificent, mature, old trees that had given its ambience for generations had all been, well, most of them had been chopped down, not on my property, but most of them had been chopped down.
What was the year, Dennis?
That year was 2007. And we knew that this was about to take place because we'd been through the process of trying to fight the redevelopment of this very special part of Sydney, and we had lost the fight. But of course, when developers come in and do this sort of thing, they don't give you a warning. They don't put a letter in your box and say, we'll be here tomorrow to wreck the neighbourhood. They put up a fence maybe a month, maybe 2 months before, and the houses next door start to get raided by opportunists who come in to take what's left inside that's of any value to them. But you just wake up one morning and there's a bulldozer or a chainsaw next door, and they set to work. Well, I happened to be away on holidays when it happened, and when I came back, the street that I'd left no longer existed as it was when I left. And I went out into the street the following morning, and I thought somebody should make a record of this. That was all my intention, was simply to make a record of it, not necessarily to go any further, maybe just for myself.
So you grabbed the camera and start recording.
So I went inside, grabbed the camera, went out into the street in the middle of the mayhem, and started to record the bulldozers tearing down these grand old Federation homes, and the chainsaws ripping through these wonderful old trees that had been there, some of them for a century.
So don't go away, because after the short break we're coming back with shadowboxing and much more of the story of Dennis. Dennis, he became a director of one film on documentary. The title of the film is, if I remember rightly, is State of Siege?
That's correct, yes.
So tell us, how does it happen with an actor to become a filmmaker and director and a producer?
Well, in the years immediately preceding the destruction of my neighbourhood, I had written 3 plays and produced them professionally in Sydney. And because of my long career in acting, I had some understanding of filmmaking, and I also, as a playwright, had some understanding of how to put a story together. So initially I thought, I'll tell the story of this little pocket of Sydney and what happened here. And maybe it'll end up on YouTube, or maybe I'll just play it for friends or whatever. But I quickly realized that if the story was going to have any purchase, I had to spread the vision of the documentary beyond where I live. And so I began to look around at what was happening in the rest of New South Wales, and I spread the story. I interviewed people in other parts of the state and took on board their stories. And then I realized there was a history to this. There was a history to what was happening in New South Wales. How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where citizens had had their rights to determine what should and shouldn't happen in the place they call home? How did this ripping away of their democratic rights happen? And so I went back and interviewed. Very fortunately, I got an interview with Jack Mundy, who was the leader of the Builders Labourers Federation back in the early 1970s, late 1960s. And Jack Mundy and the Builders Labourers Federation, I don't know whether you know, but were instrumental in saving the rocks in Sydney from demolition.
Yes.
They saved hundreds of historic buildings throughout Sydney from demolition. And so Jack had a wonderful history of a previous government that had been as destructive and as dictatorial as our present government. So my story actually began with the days of the Green Bands and what Jack Mundy, Bob Pringle and Joe Owens and others in that very radical union had done for Sydney, and Jack's philosophies. And I drew that story and then integrated it into what was happening now, and then took the story back into the 70s again to show that actually in that intervening period, nothing really had changed, that we were back to where we started.
So the government in New South Wales, the state government, introduced the new development law to developing for developers and for the state to assess developments. And that law was doing something very, very wrong.
In very simple terms, to put in very simple terms, throughout that 16-year period that the Labor government was in power in New South Wales, millions of dollars were poured into the Labor Party coffers by the development industry, and their lobby groups had enormous power within the Parliament. Their power was such that they were able to change or encourage the Minister for Planning and the state government to change the planning laws that had been instigated as a result of the Green Bands. The 1979 Environmental Planning and Assessment Act was actually a very good act, and it had been instigated by the Green Band movement. But the developers were able to, bit by bit, influence the government to whittle back community involvement in those laws to their advantage. And they had that advantage because of this system of developer donations into the party. They had influence within the party.
So with this influence all through the years, they get into the stage when they took away the rights and goggled the communities, and they have no say in the development and redevelopment of the parts of Sydney and the suburbs. Tell us, what was the experience of that new law in your suburb and in New South Wales? So what the consequences are now?
There is a great amount of disillusionment amongst the citizenry and a great amount of cynicism now about so-called processes. To talk specifically about where I come from, a municipality called Ku-ring-gai, and in many ways it's similar, albeit it doesn't have the advantage of the seaboard that the people in the western suburbs of Perth has. It's a desirable suburb to live in because it's very leafy, and very often this word is used in a derogatory term by those who think that everyone there is a silvertail and they've got more than their fair share, and that's an opinion held also in the Planning Department of New South Wales. But it's a prime development area for developers. It costs them no more there to build a unit block than it would in the less desirable area of Sydney. In fact, there were areas of Sydney throughout the time that they were imposing these ugly blocks of units throughout Ku-ring-gai. There were areas of Sydney where development applications had been approved, but they laid waste for years and years and years because the profit margins were not what they would be in Ku-ring-gai. And so they moved into Ku-ring-gai because the profit margins there were quite enormous. And there was another reason. Ku-ring-gai is probably one of the safest Conservative seats in the whole of New South Wales, if not the whole of the country. It is the seat of the present Premier of New South Wales, Barry O'Farrell. The Labor Party doesn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of ever getting a hold in there. And so, in conjunction with helping their friends in the development lobby, there was an enormous amount of malice involved in wrecking the municipality of Ku-ring-gai on the part of the Labor Party.
Because of the influence in that suburb?
Because of it being a Conservative suburb, yes. I mean, one of the mayors phoned me one night after she'd been in for a meeting with the Department of Planning. And she said to me, she was going in there to try and negotiate something, a slightly better outcome from the imposed rezonings that they were putting upon the municipality. And she said, one of the problems we face in there is, she said, they've said to me, look, you live in a suburb of silvertails. They all have more than their fair share of everything. And frankly, we don't care.
That's simple.
So that basically sums it up.
That's very simple. So how does, so what is the structure? We don't want to go into the nitty-gritties of the written law as such, but how the processes works with these development assessment panels in New South Wales?
Well, I'll give you the, I cannot speak specifically about your situation here, but you seem to have a similar situation, but I'll tell you what happened in New South Wales, and specifically in Ku-ring-gai, because you will see footage of this in the documentary. The government required of the council to create so many more new residential buildings, basically in units. Whatever the numbers were, I can't recall. So the council went back to their planners and they gave the government what they wanted. Each time they did it, the government upped the ante.
More.
They wanted more. When they went back again, the government wanted more. There was a time when the only place in Sydney that there was as much development in financial terms and physical terms taking place, the only other place was the central CBD of Sydney, outside of Ku-ring-gai. And ultimately, the government said, no, look, you're just not doing what we want you to do. And in simple terms, what they did was say, we are taking your planning laws away. We are going to impose upon you a planning panel made up of government-appointed bureaucrats, and they, in concert with your planners within your council, and during this period, your mayor is to have no contact with those planners. We're going to tell you what's going to happen in your neighbourhood, in your municipality. And so in the end, the municipality and the citizens were, and the councillors were totally disenfranchised. And you see
so
footage.
Locked out from the process.
Totally locked out from the process. Entirely locked out from the process.
And
the
that's
result,
not democratic at all.
It's not democracy at all. No, it's not.
And how
But
corruption get in to this whole thing? So we got these development assessment panels, which are making the final decisions, regardless of what the people really want, and how corruption comes in.
Well, it's a corruption of process, actually. It's a corruption of process. The corruption is, the process should be that people within those local areas have elected councillors to speak on their behalf.
Yes.
They, through their councillors and through their councillors, should be the people who have the right to say what should and shouldn't happen in the place they call home. In fact, those people know better than the so-called experts and the disinterested bureaucrats. They know better than any of those people what should and shouldn't happen. The corruption is that we live, or supposedly live, in a democratic society where we have a say in what happens within our community. And when that right is taken away, we are dealing with a corruption of the democratic process. It's a corruption of process.
The current Barnett government in Western Australia also introduced the development assessment panels in here, which is composed from 2 of the appointees from the ministry and 1 independent. So 2 to 1 is the ratio.
So it's overweighted.
It's overweighted.
In favour of the government.
And it's favour of the government and the developers. So it's no democratic at all in here. Matter of fact, more dictatorial probably than your system in New South Wales. So what do you think, why another government, another state government introduced the law which is failed in another state and proven non-democratic, very bureaucratic, dictatorial and corrupt? What do you think, what makes people in power to introduce such laws?
I think it happens because once the election is over, governments sing the tune and march to the march of powerful lobby groups and donors. Unless you have a strong third force or a genuine independent on your side within the parliament, you basically don't stand a chance. Governments work on behalf of commercial interests first and foremost. As Jack Mundy said to me when I interviewed him, he said, the problem we face with the two-party system now in Australia is that both the major parties have been corporatised. They are not political parties anymore, they are corporate entities. And unless we get that into our heads, we don't understand what's taking place and why it's taking place. It's like the American comedian, political commentator George Carlin has said, it's a big club and you're not in it. It's a big club and you're not in it.
Dennis, thank you very much for the interview and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Tibo.
And good luck for your career as a filmmaker.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget, next week, Shadowboxing, same channel, same time.